Yes.
So it sounds like there's a question.
I'll let John field it.
Well, the thing that we're discussing, Don, was this questions for personal reflection. It was the second one of the homework, and regarding the thought that okay, if we've been reborn countless times, we've been in this state or higher previous times, and yet we didn't seem to have accomplished too much. So, and how do you deal personally with that? And that's one of the riveting questions is how do we? I mean, it can be perceived to be rather depressing in some ways. Like, I think I'm getting better, but I'm in the past, I've been even better than this. And so, what's the answer?
Yeah, I don't know that there's an absolute answer, but there's certainly, I mean, there are some things to think about in regard to that. Certainly, I wasn't putting that on there to get anyone horribly depressed, but rather to recognize that, again, when we look at this whole idea of a perfect human rebirth, and we'll talk about that more in the module on exploring the path, but the idea that we've come across this amazing opportunity to practice the Dharma. There are many times when we came in touch perhaps with the teachings on developing meditation, but we didn't have the Dharma to accompany it. And that's because, again, there's only certain periods of time when Buddhas appear and they begin turning the wheel of Dharma. Then eventually the Dharma disappears from that world system, it seems, according to what the teachings say in traditional Buddhist cosmology. So essentially you have this very difficult thing to line everything up, to put everything in order for you to be able to not just practice these deep meditation techniques, but also to come into contact with the Dharma, So I guess that's the really tricky thing is, it doesn't mean that, we're horrible people because we didn't do this in our previous life. It just means that perhaps, again, the conditions weren't there for us to be able to make the best use out of that opportunity to practice these deep states of meditation. So, but yeah, it's a little challenging in that regard because those are pretty major accomplishments. When we look at, just the study we've had of it here together, you can see how much is involved in just getting calm abiding, much less getting these states of concentration and the formless absorptions. So we can give ourselves credit, I suppose, for having, done that before, but we didn't do it at a time or with the contact with the Dharma that would have allowed us to be able to make the best use out of that. So I don't know. Yeah, Marty, please.
Yeah. Well, if you attain calm abiding, you really have got to have cleaned your karma, pretty much would seem to get there. And then the part I don't understand is though, how do you fall from there?
Well, again, if the statement you made about cleaning up your karma to get there, well, to some degree, yes. I mean, we have to practice good morality to have that foundation. We saw that as one of the prerequisites for attaining calm abiding. But that doesn't mean that we've cleaned up all of our past actions. We've been in samsara since beginningless time. So we've created negative karma through the force of our ignorance and delusions, so many times, and a lot of it we're simply unaware of because it's in the recesses of our mind and hasn't yet ripened into the result. So karma is a very dynamic process. It's not something where just what we do in this life is affecting, these things, but what we've done in prior lives is still sort of waiting in the shadows and can come forward depending upon, again, other causes and conditions. So it's understandable that every one of us, until we've done the deeper work of sort of disempowering that karma, which is through realizing emptiness directly and attaining these greater realizations, until you've done that deeper work, there's always that karma that's waiting there. And unless you've done something that will purify it, it will still be sitting there waiting to ripen. So this is how it happens. And even when people get these good rebirths, if they don't do something to assure that that's the karma that will keep moving them into their next existence. That's why that's the first level of the path, stages of the path to enlightenment, is to really work on making sure that we have a continuity of good rebirths. And if we keep putting kind of that karma to the front until we can do the deeper work to remove, kind of make ineffective all of these karmic seeds through direct realization of emptiness, that's the only time we're going to be assured that we're not going to fall into the lower states. So at least when you attain pretty high realizations, I think it's even just before you attain the direct realization, but it's pretty far along on the bodhisattva path before you can definitely close the door to the lower realms, to where you'll never be reborn in any of those lower states through the force of karma and delusions. You may still take rebirth there out of compassion for beings in those suffering realms, but you wouldn't take rebirth there through the force of your karma. So does that answer your question, Marty, or your comment?
Perfectly.
Yeah, okay. It's karma is a very dynamic thing. It's like it's this whole force is just sort of we're swimming in, and at any time something can come in. This is why people's lives can be changed irrevocably, just in a moment. And when the causes and conditions ripen, and that karma comes to the forefront, and manifests in whatever it is that we have to experience, then there's nothing more we can really do about it at that point. If we had purified it previously or had never planted it in the first place, it'd be a different story. But unfortunately, we plant a lot of karma through the force of our ignorance, and we don't necessarily address it so effectively through our purification. So we'll talk a little bit about purification and karma in the module on exploring the path. So any other questions for tonight? No?
Well, I think we had a little bit of a discussion about just the whole general topic last week and how to kind of put it in perspective, how to integrate it into where we're at. We're beginners. I'm a beginner. I shouldn't speak for everybody else. I'm a beginner.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what were some of the comments that people said? I mean, was there something that someone said that they'd want to share? Yeah, John.
Well, I think Don was, a few of us thought that the subject itself seemed really daunting. Like we had difficulty comprehending it, to getting it all in. It seemed like there's some concepts there that we weren't really fully aware of. And I personally, I was using the expression, I thought I'd become an upside down cup.
Where, nothing could get in.
No, I was
Well,
listening.
yeah.
It wasn't really absorbing. But it's funny, Don, when you read back over, because I didn't realize I had to be the facilitator of this, so I had to do my homework. And reading over it again, it is amazing. You think you got it, and then you read it again, and you think, "Oh, I didn't get it. I better read it again." It was quite but yeah, that was one of the thoughts I think we had. Is it just seemed to be a very difficult topic for some of us, and some of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some degree, not to say that we won't actually attain those levels at some point. As I mentioned last week, we can actually use just calm abiding as a support for pursuing our path to directly realizing emptiness and so on. And if you have that union of calm abiding and special insight, then you have everything that you need, in a sense, to make progress on the path. So it's not to say that some of us won't go on to develop those states of concentration and the formless absorptions. But for many of us, perhaps it's really mostly just knowing that that's out there, and knowing that there is that possibility of deepening our concentration to that degree. As I said last week, the fourth concentration is said to actually be a very powerful support. And I think I pointed out that it's because in one way, it's because you no longer have any of the feelings of happiness or bliss, these pleasant feelings that can be distracting to the meditator. Instead, you end up with a feeling of equanimity, which might sound kind of boring, but if you have this sort of neutral feeling, then there's nothing to sort of take you off track, and you can make that mind very powerful. And of course, it's also a more deeply concentrated mind. So So again, I can see where they're daunting. My own suggestion about having an entire module on meditation, which I may have mentioned previously in the original pilot draft proposal, there wasn't a module on meditation. And one of the other teachers mentioned something about making sure meditation is included. And of course, we try to include it in the individual courses. But I also was of the mindset that it would be good to have an entire module dedicated to it. And then you go, well, what would need to be in there? And this topic is one that I think is good to introduce people to, but I don't expect people to have a perfect understanding of what these are like, or to even be able to clearly imagine what those states of concentration would seem like or be like. We're most of us working on just trying to get our monkey minds to be a little calmer, to be a little more focused. And we haven't even really approached attaining calm abiding, most of us. So I'd say that's probably the more important thing to focus on. So it was mostly out of desire to share that information, so that when you hear these terms, or when you hear what the form realm and the formless realm, you have some idea of how these come about, and that other sort of part of experience we can have with the mind that is much more profound and deep, but nonetheless, not something we're all going to attain in this lifetime, probably. May not even attain it before attaining enlightenment. They say when you attain enlightenment, all these states sort of naturally come because you have a mind that is in this pristine, purified state. So it's not that you have to have those states of mind before you become enlightened. You will have access to all realms of mind, certainly when you attain Buddhahood. But that's even more daunting, perhaps, to talk about and hear about. So, yeah.
No, I think that's right, Don. I mean, having gone back over it, at least it's there. You don't know what you don't know. So I really didn't know this before. So it is definitely found beneficial, but at the same time, it was in that regard.
I think tonight's topic will be a little more practical in some regard. There's also a few little kind of technical parts of it, but it's much more practical in terms of giving us something we can actually sit down and meditate on that will be useful to understand truth a little more in terms of conventional reality as well as ultimate reality. So I don't know, it's getting close to. Is there one other question perhaps before we begin, or comment? Yes, Mary Jo, please.
Yes, I have a comment really, and a question that's very simple, I'm sure of it. First, I just want to comment, my signal is going in and out. I think I'm having a hard time having patience with it.
Okay.
And also this, the information is quite overwhelming to me. Mm-hmm. And it leaves me feeling really frustrated, really. And like even in one of the early slides, it referred to the Sharavaka vehicle and the Bodhisattva vehicle. And I didn't have time to look up and see what is that about? What is that referring to?
Sure. Why don't you hold on, Mary Jo, because that will be coming up in tonight's slides, and I will talk about it then.
Fine.
But no, I know that there's a lot of terminology. When you get the slides in advance, then you might read through them and you go, oh no, what is that? What is that? And I try to explain things, but certainly if there's ever a time when you feel like I've glossed over some terminology in the lecture, please put something in the chat box just saying, what is Shravaka, for example, if I forget to talk about that, or what is this, that, and there are don't feel like you have to be embarrassed about putting questions on there that perhaps other people might know the answers to. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, who don't know the answers to them as well. So please, anytime that I say something or show something on a slide and I forget to make that comment on it, I'd appreciate that. Okay. All right, good. Well, why don't we go ahead and start our class, since it is 7 o'clock. A lot of folks have come in since we started the Q&A, and I'm hoping there'll be a little bit of time at the end to do some Q&A. I want to do a very brief review of what we've done in this module, but so let's begin our 6th and final module of Exploring Meditation with the prayers that we usually do, reciting the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha together 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we do the mandala offering as usual. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge in bodhicitta. We'll do the first time in English and then the other 2 in my horrible chanting Tibetan. So hang in there with me on this. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Dupar Sho. Okay, let's do a short meditation. And spend the first few minutes just doing a meditation on the breath. Again, keeping in mind some of the things we've learned from this module in terms of trying to maintain mindfulness, not non-forgetfulness with regard to the breath. To have, I forgot to turn the, let me turn my phone off while I have a chance. Otherwise it may come back on. Okay. Let's see if that works. May not. Sorry. There, I think that will do it. Okay, sorry about that. So again, just keeping your mindfulness of the breath, making sure that you don't forget that object, using your introspection to check in occasionally to see the quality of your meditation. And if you've wandered away, gotten distracted, excitement, whatever, or if the mind's gotten very heavy and dull, then we correct that. We bring our awareness back to the breath, tighten our focus if it's gotten very loose, and loosen it if it's gotten too tight. And then again, just try to maintain your concentration on the breath as best as you can. So I'll do that, ring the bell now to begin, and then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in setting motivation. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And recall that as we looked at last week, meditation can be used to develop a lot of peace in this life, to experience states of well-being that we haven't even known. And it can also even create the causes for rebirth in these upper realms, the form and formless realms. But our motivation for practicing meditation and for learning about meditation is always so that we can use it as a tool to discern truth, to know reality. We'll talk about this more tonight, but to know reality first at the conventional level, to understand how things work in terms of karma, in terms of the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths and so on. But moreover, to learn that ultimate level of reality, to discern truth at the deepest level, recalling that it is only due to our misconceptions, grasping at things to exist in a way that is opposite to how they actually exist, that we are in this problem to begin with, that we are unenlightened to begin with. So every time we turn our minds towards any sort of Dharma practice, but especially with regard to the topic of meditation, we do so with that motivation to use our learning, our practice, everything we do to be able to eventually know the true nature of things, and in knowing that, to be able to remove everything that obscures our own minds. And moreover, to be able to develop everything that is positive and beneficial, that will lead to the greatest possible welfare for both ourselves and others. And this is our motivation of bodhicitta, the sincere wish to benefit others to the greatest degree by developing ourselves to the greatest degree. Okay, wonderful. So again, tonight we are moving on to the last topic in this six-session course on exploring meditation, this module of Exploring Buddhism. So I also wanted to say a little bit at the end, if I can. I might even allude to it a few times during class tonight about the next module that's coming up in January. But let's go ahead and I'll pull up on screen the overall outline for this in terms of what topics we've looked at already. Again, beginning with how we had a meditation session set up so that we could make the most out of it, the basic types and components of meditation, which I'm going to touch on a little bit again tonight, because this last thing that we're looking at, this last topic for tonight, is going to actually touch on both types of meditation. And then we went through 2 classes about how to train in calm abiding and how we develop the various mental states. And hopefully that was inspiring. That is something that perhaps we can all look to possibly attain in this life if we put our nose to the grindstone, as they say, and just really do the work. And then last week, we looked at this topic of the concentrations of the form and formless realms. Again, a bit of a challenging topic, one that perhaps we won't be utilizing the teachings on in this life, perhaps some of you will, but we can at least have some appreciation for the depths to which we can develop our meditative concentration and the possibilities of the mind becoming more powerful through that. And again, even just to have that knowledge can be useful, hopefully, because this is a topic that does come up occasionally in our Buddhist studies, and it certainly comes up in the basic program, which this is again meant to be a bridge for those of you who might go on to study the basic program. Tonight's topic is what we're calling the 4 close placements of mindfulness. There's another name for this in His Holiness and Venerable Children's book, where they call it the 4 establishments of mindfulness. I'll talk about the difference in that terminology shortly. But let me introduce this by showing you kind of how this particular set of meditations, because this one again is much more specific, and it is something we all can engage in, where it fits in the overall schema of things in terms of what are called the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. You may have heard that term before, or the 37 aids to awakening, they're sometimes called. So this is what His Holiness and Venerable Children said in a book that was published some time ago on all the various Buddhist traditions. They said, built on the foundation of the three higher trainings, the higher training in ethical conduct, concentration, and then the third one, the higher training in wisdom itself, involves the practice of the 37 aids to awakening and leads to insights. We have to build our trainings on the basis of good morality. We already spoke to this. You have to have good morality to develop deep concentration. That's the second of the higher trainings as they're set out in the Lam Rim. And then the third higher training of wisdom. In order to really deepen our wisdom, our special insight, we have to have calm abiding, that very focused mind, that is involved in developing concentration. So in order to develop the higher training in wisdom, you need those two, but it essentially involves what are often called these 37 harmonies with enlightenment or aids to awakening that do lead to insight into emptiness. While not all 37 aids are considered higher training in wisdom, they all directly or indirectly contribute to the cultivation of the wisdom that understands selflessness, emptiness, and the four truths correctly. Again, a topic of the next module when we look at exploring the truths, and thus leads to liberation. So again, I'm not going to go through all 37 of these, but the four close placements of mindfulness are the very first ones on the list. And so it is important to understand that they are taught often in the context of those 37 aids to awakening, or again, harmonies with enlightenment. The 37 aids are explained in both the Pali and the Sanskrit sutras and are valued practices in all three vehicles. So in the Pali, the most renowned sutra that teaches it is the Satipatthana Sutra, where the Buddha goes into very great depths about these four close placements. But in the Sanskrit sutras, they are taught in the Sutra of the 10 Grounds, I believe, and a couple of others. But they are definitely a practice that we don't hear about quite as much, perhaps, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So it says the main differences in how the 37 aids are practiced in the Shravaka and Bodhisattva vehicles is that Bodhisattvas do them with a bodhicitta motivation and apply them to all sentient beings. So we know what a bodhisattva is. We've heard this before, and we know bodhicitta. Bodhisattva is a being who has bodhicitta at what's called a spontaneous or an uncontrived level, meaning that through the force of their meditation and familiarity with that, they have entered into the Mahayana path. Well, there are two other paths that the Buddha taught, and these are both part of what was traditionally called the Hinayana rather than Mahayana. But Hinayana starts sounding a bit derogatory at times because Hina literally means lesser and Maha means great. And so it makes it sound like one is better than the other, but they are all paths that the Buddha taught. It's just that the paths that are in the Hinayana, or sometimes called the fundamental vehicle, individual vehicle, those will only lead to one's own nirvana, to one's own solitary peace, which is a wonderful attainment, amazing accomplishment. But it's for those who don't yet have the capacity to take on what the Mahayana entails, which is becoming enlightened for the sake of all beings, dedicating yourself to the welfare of all beings, which again, we'll be talking more about as we get into especially the fourth module on exploring the path. But the idea here is that you have these two other disciples, people who are inclined towards Buddhism, who aren't yet ready to take anything beyond their own individual liberation. And that's great that they can accomplish their own individual liberation. But these two are called the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha, though they're often summarized under Shravaka. Shravaka, the word Shravaka that was on the screen a short while ago, that means hearer or listener. And the idea is that these are practitioners of that individual vehicle who hear the Mahayana teachings, but don't necessarily practice them. They also, will acclaim to others their own spiritual realizations and what have you, so others can hear the accomplishments and be inspired by them. But essentially they are, they do gather with other teachers and other disciples and so on. The other of these practitioners who are on the individual vehicle are called Pratyeka Buddhas. Pratyeka Buddhas, they're not Buddhas, but Buddha in that context means a realizer. And they are usually called solitary realizers, Pratyeka Buddha. Just like Pratimoksha, you might have heard that term that means individual liberation. This is Pratyeka Buddha, individual or solitary realizers. They might practice through their initial lives with in community, with a congregation, a lot of people, but they have this idea that they want to attain their state of liberation in their final lifetime, in a place where there are no Buddhas, are no teachers. So they want this they have this solitary wish. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he says this makes them sound like they're really prideful. But he said, actually, they want this as well so that they can then teach the Dharma to others, having attained their realizations in ways that are a bit unconventional through various manifestations and what have you. So they actually seem to have more compassion in terms of their final goal than what the hearers do. But nonetheless, they don't have the compassion of a bodhisattva. Well, according to our tradition in the Mahayana, both of those Pratyeka Buddhas and Shravakas, solitary realizers and hearers, they complete their path and they become what we call an arhat, or a foe destroyer. An arhat is someone who has completely destroyed the foe of the afflictions, gotten rid of all of the afflictive obscurations, so that they are then liberated from taking rebirth through the force of karma and delusions. So they've escaped samsara, they've attained the solitary peace of nirvana. But according to the Mahayana tradition, they haven't yet kind of gone to the final length of their potential. They haven't developed themselves fully. And so what they say happens is when they exit from that life, they go into a state of solitary peace, but they are eventually stirred from that by a Buddha who has some sort of karma with them that beckons them to come forward into the Mahayana path to complete their full spiritual development. So essentially, they haven't achieved the final goal of Buddhahood, but they have attained nonetheless a pretty remarkable accomplishment in attaining their own solitary nirvana, their own solitary peace. So what is being said here is that in both the Pali tradition, which tends to, I don't want to make them exclusive, it tends to favor those of the Shravaka lineage, those of the hearer lineage who are intent upon individual liberation. And then the Sanskrit tradition, which is mostly in the Mahayana, tends to favor the Bodhisattva vehicle. And so essentially you have both of these that are practicing the four close placements of mindfulness. So let's put the slide back on the screen and just make sure I've clarified all that. So again, the main difference in how those who are inclined towards the hearer vehicle, or even again, the solitary realizer vehicle, versus the bodhisattva vehicles of these three vehicles, is that bodhisattvas do them with bodhicitta motivation. The motivation of a Shravaka or a Pratyeka Buddha is renunciation and the desire to attain nirvana, solitary peace for oneself. And again, those bodhisattvas, besides having bodhicitta motivation, they also apply an understanding of them when they're observing all sentient beings to understand. And I'll talk about that later when we get into the techniques for developing these. Okay. Of the 37 harmonies, this is from a different book now, where the harmonies is being used rather than aids to awakening. Of the 37 harmonies, the 4 establishments or close placements of mindfulness are explained at the beginning, because all 37 harmonies must be cultivated with mindfulness. The chief objects for us to be mindful of in this context are the following 4, and you'll hear them again and again tonight: the body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, because these are the basis of designation of the I or person. Now, when we talk about them being the basis of designation for a person, then we talk about, for the individual investigation of these, it would start with your own body, your physical form. Feelings would be all of the mental factors of feelings, the various feelings, tones that arise in our mental continuum. Remember, that's an omnipresent mental factor that we have that is registering at any particular time as pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. And then mind is referring to the main consciousnesses that we have, the primary minds, mental consciousness, and the 5 sense consciousnesses. And then finally, phenomena. Phenomena here can be thought of to refer to everything that is not those 3 that preceded. But in the context of a person, we're talking about all the other mental factors. So when we talk about the basis of designation for a person, it's the physical form, the body, and then everything else that is mental, which is feelings and the other mental factors, and then mind, the main consciousnesses. So in that way, you've got body and mind, the body-mind complex. It's just being looked at in a very specific way for reasons that I'm going to get into shortly. Okay. So let me take it off screen just a moment to take you to that one handout that Gina kindly sent out to everyone that has a chart on the front and a chart on the back. On the second page. These are the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. And of course, I bold-faced the first one, just show this is where it is in regard to the 37. These 4 close placements of mindfulness are described as the path that thoroughly investigates things. This is what this meditation is involved in, is investigating these 4 categories of things: body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, and investigating them in a couple of specific ways, or particular ways. And the ones that, again, I won't go through each of these. I just wanted to give you the listing, the 4 correct abandonings. And by the way, these are practiced and kind of brought to their culmination as one moves through the path, coming closer and closer to one's own liberation, if you're a Sravaka or a Pratyeka Buddha, or coming closer to your own enlightenment in the case of a Bodhisattva. After the 4 correct abandonings is the 4 legs of magical emanation, where you actually acquire an ability to manifest in a variety of ways. Then the 5 powers and the 5 strengths, which are actually the same 5 mental factors. It's just that they have different power and then a higher, greater strength when we get to another level. These are, again, ways that we develop our mind to have greater force in removing obstacles, obscurations, what have you. Then the last 2, the 7 branches of enlightenment, which is a repetition of some of what we saw in some of the 5 powers and 5 strengths, but also includes some additional things. And then finally, what is called here the 8 branches of Arya's paths. You may know these by the Eightfold Noble Path. Many of you have heard this terminology. This is a main area of focus in the Pali tradition, is to work with the correct view, correct thought, and so on, and practice those throughout one's spiritual development. Even though here they're at kind of the apex of these 37, they are brought to their culmination further down the path. But the idea is that close placements of mindfulness are the beginning point, because as was pointed out, you need mindfulness to practice all of the others. So that's just to give you a little taste of that. It's not meant to kind of go into any great detail. If you do go on to take the course on chapter 4 of Maitreya's Ornament, that's in the basic program, that will kind of fill in a lot more detail about these 37 harmonies with enlightenment. But it is interesting. They are a set of teachings that are practiced and meditations that are practiced by both those on the path leading to individual liberation, again, the hearers and solitary realizers, as well as the bodhisattvas. So we don't hear so much about these. In fact, I might even read a little bit from what Venerable Chodron says in here at the very beginning of the section on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. She says, nowadays, most non-Tibetans receive teachings on the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, which again, we'll be going into the module after next. And after some contemplation of Lam Rim topics, even receive tantric empowerments and make tantric sadhanas their daily practice. And some of you in the Zoom room, I'm sure, have received tantric empowerments. After a while, some people begin to feel that their practice isn't advancing. I believe one remedy is to spend more time contemplating Lam Rim topics and meditating on the 4 establishments of mindfulness before entering Tantra. Of course, I always emphasize this with anybody who's talking to me about Tantra. You really have to have a strong, solid foundation in the Lam Rim to begin with. But she even goes so far as to encourage working with these 4 close placements of mindfulness as a very powerful tool for us to be able to get a good grasp on some of the ways that things exist conventionally, as well as I said, to investigate the ultimate nature of things, because this is used as a technique to look at both. And then she says, gaining a firm conviction in the Buddhist worldview, as explained in the Lam Rim and Indian treatises, stabilizes our mind. By understanding the Arya's 4 truths, the Noble Truths, and the attendant topics they include, we understand our present situation and how to change it. And she goes on to say, by practicing this topic, the 4 establishments of mindfulness, we will become intimately familiar with our situation as samsaric beings in an experiential way. Before visualizing ourselves as deities with a body made of light, which is what you do in the tantric practices, right? And a mind experiencing great bliss, understanding our present body, feelings, mind, and phenomena is helpful. We will better understand who we are at present what to practice and abandon on the path, and the purpose and method of Tantra. So I like that she included that in there because it really gives some great credence and importance to studying this topic. So without further ado, let's get deeper into this topic and take a look at what is entailed in practicing these 4 close placements of mindfulness. I already did a little bit of an overview, but this is going to be even a little further overview, maybe a greater overview, more in-depth overview, and then talk a little bit about their objects. Then we're going to go into the objects in more detail and the unique purposes of this, like why did the Buddha choose those particular objects and encourage us to meditate on them in that way. And then we'll actually look at the modes of cultivating them, which is the main thing I want to emphasize tonight, is how do we actually practice this? Okay. The purpose of the 4 I want to call them close placements anyway. The purpose of the 4 establishments of mindfulness is to gain direct insight into the nature of our body and mind, and to use this wisdom to eliminate the afflictions that bind us to samsara. Through realizing the body and mind are impermanent and unsatisfactory, which are 2 of the main sort of general characteristics that we look at in regard to all 4 of these phenomena, or 4 of these categories. And we want to then generate, they say, the wisdom realizing emptiness that eradicates the ignorance that is the root of samsara. Emptiness is another characteristic that is involved with the general characteristics of all things, because everything is empty of inherent existence. But the idea is that we need to also understand conventional reality. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but when the Buddha came to this world, he didn't come just to teach us emptiness, this ultimate view of reality. He also had to show us how conventional reality works. If we really think about it, again, most of us are blind to that when we came to the Buddha's teachings. This is what you start with generally. They don't, on your very first teaching, usually, they don't introduce you to the topic of emptiness, because that's a much deeper way of looking at reality. But most of us don't have an understanding of karma. We don't have an understanding of the delusions and the nature of our own minds. We don't have an understanding of the way the Buddha set out the 4 Noble Truths in terms of what our exact situation is. This is all revolutionary. It gives us a different paradigm for how we are looking at the world that we live in, the samsaric experience that we're having. These 4 close placements of mindfulness, as was said in there, they help us to engage in these topics with an understanding of how things are conventionally, how we can really see things clearly there, and moreover, how we can also understand things at an ultimate level in terms of the wisdom of emptiness. And through this, we can then accomplish all that the path to enlightenment promises, which is to be able to know how things work so that we can realize emptiness and eventually become enlightened. So there's great importance to this topic. Again, it is a shame that it's not emphasized quite as much, like Venerable Chodron says. To gain this insight, sharp mindfulness and deep concentration are necessary. The 4 establishments of mindfulness accomplish this. So we can say that both kind of developing of mindful awareness that again is going to be infused with some level of wisdom, as well as a very stable mind, both of these can be accomplished through the 4 close placements of mindfulness. It's like another technique to develop both stabilizing meditation as well as analytical meditation. So then he goes on to say, well, actually, let me take it off for just 1 second. There was another quote I want to share from here that's on this topic of kind of how these play a role. She says, this is on page 329. That previous, by the way, was just a few pages back from that, 327 and 328. On 329, they say, some teachers teach the 4 establishments of mindfulness, especially mindfulness of the breath, which is how they use them in the Pali tradition, is when they talk about the body, they use the breath because the breath is what our body is doing all the time. And so it becomes the object of observation there. They say that they teach these as a means to develop serenity, calm abiding. Others teach it as a method leading to insight, to vipassana, to the developing insight into emptiness and so on. It may be used in either or both ways. Training the mind to be continually mindful of the meditation object stabilizes and calms the mind, increasing our concentration. So whenever we're kind of in that mode of maintaining our mindfulness of the body that we are observing or whatever object we're looking at in these 4, when we are doing that, we're increasing our stability. We're calming the mind. Mindfulness also knows its object and its characteristics and qualities well, generating the understanding that leads to insight. Because this is what we're going to see shortly when we look at the definition for this. It actually includes both a component of mindfulness and wisdom. So it's not just the non-forgetfulness that stays with the object that we're meditating on. It is also maintaining the awareness of the insight that we've developed through examining these topics. So it's a very unique type of meditation because it's using both of these in a single meditation. Again, I'm not saying it's that unique, but it's definitely meant to focus on these two complementing each other as we do this investigation. Okay, so on the same screen here, we get an explanation of why they called them establishments in this book. They called them establishments because they set up or establish mindfulness. They concern not only the object of mindfulness, but also the way mindfulness of these four objects is established. So they're establishing the mindfulness by being aware of particular qualities, aspects of these objects. So there's a different, I mean, they're not just called simply mindfulness. Again, they're called the four establishments of mindfulness or four close placements of mindfulness, but it's because you are establishing a particular way of maintaining that awareness. Let me explain to you why some texts call them close placements, though, which I actually is the preferred, translation equivalent for the term here. As I've mentioned before, this happens all the time with Tibetan Buddhism. Different translators choose different terms, so you always have to and it's kind of nice in some ways because you get a different flavor of what is meant by that term. But this is how Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen, in a translation of a text he wrote on ornament, the text I mentioned earlier, Maitreya's text that is in the basic program, the fourth chapter is studied there. He defines it in the following way. He says, through mindfulness, wisdom is closely placed on. That is, it does not forget the object of observation. Therefore, such an exalted knower is called a close placement of mindfulness. The idea is you're kind of placing the mind closely with regard to the object so that you maintain the awareness of whatever it is that you're focused on, which would again be the aspects, the qualities that we're going to be examining. So we're not just holding a single pointed awareness as we often do in calm abiding practice, for the entire time. We're also using the insight into discerning these particular qualities with regard to the body. We're going to look at specifically its impurity as opposed to the way we tend to grasp at it as being pure and clean and what have you. So again, we'll get into this in more detail, but there is some purpose to this etymology of placing close, meaning maintaining a nearness with regard to what it is that you are focused on. So it'll become a little clearer as we go through the individual topics and the meditation on them. So let's continue on, carry on. Gaining a firm conviction in the Buddhism. This is actually what I just read. I forgot that I put that in here. By understanding, again, all of these topics, we understand our present situation, how to change it. Again, I just read that earlier, so I don't need to read it again. And then, of course, by practicing these four, we will become intimately familiar with our situation as samsaric beings. Mindfulness on the body, feelings, mind, and phenomena leads us to understand, especially impermanence and emptiness. Though, as I said, it can also help us to understand the dissatisfactory nature of samsara, other truths that the Buddha taught about our situation. Okay. Let's go to look at a definition of it. And there also was the same, very similar definition on the other handout that I had Gina send out to all of you. A definition of establishment of mindfulness is an exalted knower, and then in parentheses, of someone who has entered a path. But this is the more technical definition. It doesn't mean that you have to have entered a path, like entered the Shravaka path through having uncontrived renunciation, or entered the Bodhisattva path through having uncontrived bodhicitta. It means that anyone can practice these, as we're going to see in a future slide. But essentially it says this is an exalted knower. It's an elevated form of wisdom included within either mindfulness or wisdom. It includes both factors, both mental factors. Remember, those two factors are among the object ascertaining mental factors, which are not omnipresent necessarily, but they're there when we are getting at an object, ascertaining it. So, and it says it's included within either of those that meditates on the four bodies, feelings, mind, and phenomena through examining the specific and the general characteristics of each of them. So this is the idea behind this, is that we're going to be looking at these characteristics in a moment. We can talk about how all four, body through phenomena, how they all have general characteristics that relate to every one of them. But then we can also take each of them individually and talk about a particular characteristic that we're going to focus on that will help us to understand some deeper level of truth, that we can discern from the Buddha's teachings. So let's again keep carrying on, because a lot of what I'm saying alludes to things that we're going to get to, which is, we're on the cusp of here. So it says, although this definition places this practice as one accomplished by a person who has already entered a path of any of the three vehicles, again, Shravaka, Partika Buddha, Bodhisattva, it is also done by people who have not yet entered a path. This practice is powerful and beneficial for everyone. So we get some nice advertising from Venerable Chodron and the Dalai Lama on that. So in the four establishments of mindfulness, the meaning of mindfulness is slightly different than in other contexts, and I've alluded to this already. As before, here mindfulness functions to keep the mind on its chosen object, to not forget it. In addition, it is combined with powerful wisdom that understands the four objects in regard to those characteristics, their general characteristics, their specific characteristics, what have you. Then it says, thus, establishing mindfulness means to place our mindfulness on an object comprehended by wisdom. So we do have to do some analytical investigation in regard to these. But then once we have a discernment of that wisdom, we then become mindful of that wisdom with respect to the body, the feelings, and so on, all the various things we're going to look at. Okay, so that gives you maybe a little deeper view of what we mean by these four close placements. Let's go into the actual objects themselves and the unique purposes of these, this meditation technique in relation to those four objects. So first of all, we have the body. And as I said earlier, when we talk about meditating for oneself, which is where I would advise you to start, is to simply do it as an investigation into the continuum of things that are the basis for you, that are part of the basis for your being. The body refers to your own physical body. But if we break that down, even though one of these doesn't seem like it's part of our own body, we can talk about three kinds of body. There's the internal body, which is referring to the five sense faculties or powers. These I've alluded to in the first module. We talked about them in brief as being this kind of clear, lucid matter that is embedded in our physical organs. So your eyeball, in scientific terms, Western science, we would say that the reason why the eye can see is because it has, the rods inside and the retina and all the various parts. I'm not a biologist or anything, somebody who would know all those sorts of things, eye doctor. So essentially you have an empowerment of the eye by way of this physical matter. Well, in Buddhism, you have an empowerment of the eye to know visible objects through the force of this subtle, clear matter. And it's said that certain clairvoyants, remember we talked about clairvoyance last week, certain clairvoyants who have that ability can discern that matter. They can actually see it in the physical eyes and in the ears and what have you. But of course, again, Western science would take great issue with this. But whether you have belief in this or not, we're talking about that subtle way in which our senses are empowered. Our eyes to see visual form, our ears to hear sound, our bodies to know tactile sensations, and so on. So essentially, these are our internal body because they are within the continuum of the body and they empower us in that way. We also have external form, which in this case, our external body refers to the environment and things in it that are the five sense objects, as well as the sense faculties of others. Again, this gets to be hard to explain. And I'm not going to be able to explain perfectly all of these because they didn't really provide many teachings on these. But the idea is that you can include, when we talk about body, because it is referring to physical matter, it's the only one, again, that is specifically physical matter in regard to these four. It is, by extension, those things that we know through our sense faculties, the sense objects that we partake of, that are objects of enjoyment in regard to this body. And then it says the sense faculties of others. I'm not sure again how to quite explain that, because you can probably discern them again through these clairvoyance, but I'm not really, with a certain clairvoyance. But then finally, both internal and external are the coarse physical organs, which of course includes, because we have tactile sensation in there, it includes pretty much our entire body. Yes, there are some parts of our body, our hair, and what have you, where we don't have any tactile sensation. But nonetheless, we would say that everything else that is considered both internal and external would be the rest of our body. Having said that, you can still just do a general meditation on the body. You don't have to use one of these specific objects necessarily. I would just say, just be focused on the body that appears to you in terms of the totality of the body and all of its various manifestations. Secondly, feelings. I talked about this earlier, so I don't need to spend much time on it. These are the feeling tones or sensations that we experience whenever we come into contact with an object, whether that object be something physical or whether it be something we bring to mind, purely mental. And these can be of three tones then: pleasurable, painful, and neutral or equanimous feeling, the feeling of equanimity, which we again just discussed earlier. That was the feeling that one has when one reaches the fourth concentration that we talked about last week. So we have a feeling tone all the time. Again, anytime we're in contact with something, which is all the time, there's always some sort of object for the mind, even in its very subtle states, then we have a feeling tone arising. And they're only going to be of three types. Again, there will be gradations among this. You can have extremely pleasurable feelings, and then you can have slightly pleasurable feelings. And you can have very, very painful feelings, or you can have somewhat painful feelings. And then you have something we call neutral, which if you pay attention and do this type of meditation, perhaps neutral feelings get to be pretty common. And they're really throughout our day where we're not charged one way or another. So there's another way of looking at it, which again, I'm not going to go into great detail. It can also be referring to inner, outer, and then both. Inner are those we ourselves experience, which is what the main meditation would be when we are looking at our own basis of feelings. Outer feelings are those experienced by others. Here, the bodhisattvas would again want to look at the experiences of others to be cognizant of their feelings. And then both are the feelings experienced by the tactile consciousness in the coarse physical sense organs. Again, they didn't provide any real explanation in the text, so I have a hard time giving any more elaboration on that. But essentially, as I said, when we're meditating on feelings, we can just use our own experience of the feelings that arise on the landscape of our kind of going about our day. Mind. Mind refers to the six primary consciousnesses. Again, the five sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. When we divide it up a bit and look at it in terms of inner, outer, and both, inner mind is said to be the mental consciousness. Well, why is that so? Our mental consciousness is dependent upon sense consciousnesses to reach the outer world, right? Our mental consciousness doesn't know anything without the sense consciousness being involved, if it is a physical object, if it is something that we are only experiencing through the senses, and then the mental consciousness sort of takes it on. Remember, we talked in the first module about how mostly it's our conceptual mind within the mental consciousness that creates a mental image of the taste of strawberries or the sound of a violin or whatever it is that we are, experiencing. Again, we can know things purely through our mental consciousness. We don't have to depend upon sense consciousness. But for any objects that appear to the sense consciousnesses, we need that as a doorway through which we can then, know those. We need an outer consciousness, which is the five sense consciousnesses that know those things. And then the inner is the mental consciousness that works with those as well as works with ideas like emptiness and impermanence and what have you. Then we have that which is both. And in this case, the mind that apprehends the sense organs. Once more, I'm clueless as to why they chose that, why that is selected as both inner and outer, but it does seem like it's the mind that is somehow being present with the sense organs. And because the sense organs are within our own continuum, and it's the mind that is observing those, perhaps that's why it's being highlighted as both inner and outer, because you have a sense of outerness in that it's observing something that's outside of the scope of mental consciousness, but it's also inner because it's still within the continuum of the being, but I'm just guessing at that. Okay, phenomena. As I said earlier, this refers to all other phenomena, both impermanent and permanent, that have not been included in body, feelings, and mind. Remember, we discussed the categories of phenomena in the last module, but essentially those things that are impermanent are the main focus of it here. And in particular, the various mental factors that arise in our minds that are impermanent in nature. They change moment by moment. There are phenomena that are permanent. They aren't the main focus of this meditation. Why? Because none of them are the basis for a person, right? We're using this primarily to investigate our own personhood. And the basis for that are the form, our body, and then our minds, which are the feelings, minds, and then the other mental factors. So again, I'm just including this other because it was in His Holiness and Venerable Chodron's book, but in another context, we could say that this is referring to three types of phenomena. The inner phenomena that are the true paths that one has to develop on the path to awakening. And then the outer phenomena, which are the true cessations, which are not minds. They are a permanent phenomena. They are an absence of a level of affliction. So we'll talk more about them in a future class, but we did refer to them a little bit in the first module. They're one of the classes of permanent phenomena. And then the inner and outer, which in this case happens to be persons themselves. So again, I can't say so much, and I probably should have just left them off the slides in retrospect, but nonetheless, the main thing to emphasize here is that you have four phenomena that are going to be examined. You're going to have your physical form, which is your body and the various parts of the body, what have you. You're going to have feelings, which are not the whole range of emotions that we sometimes talk about and when we refer to feelings in the West, but rather the three feeling tones of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And we're going to have mind, which is the main consciousnesses, our five sense consciousnesses, our mental consciousness. And then finally, phenomena, which we're going to mostly focus on, not the wide range of other phenomena, but rather the mental factors that we have within our mind as well. The other 50 mental factors, the 51 that we looked at, again, that not being a completely inclusive list, but nonetheless, those are the main ones that are studied in Buddhist practice. So that's an introduction to those four objects. Well, what's the purpose behind using those four objects? The reason these four objects are selected as objects of mindfulness is to show us ordinary beings four conceptual errors. These are often talked about, the four incorrect or four mistaken conceptions, I think is how Rinpoche talks about them in a book called Bodhisattva Attitude. He goes into them a bit. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm doing it again. I have to erase that because we're going to get to those later. These are other four conceptual errors in relation to the sense of self that we have. So erase that, hold on to that other one. I'll come back and visit it in a few slides. This has to do with kind of the sense of self that we have in relation to these four, because as I said earlier, they're the basis for a being, for a person. The first one is conceiving our body to be the residence or place where the self resides. I mean, this is the sense of location we have with this body, right? That's why when some people talk about having an out-of-body experience, it feels so weird to not be in the place where your body is, because we have this sense that I am here inside my body, as it says. Secondly, conceiving our feelings to be what the self enjoys and experiences. I feel happy, I feel miserable, I feel indifferent. Of course, we enjoy the happy ones, but the feelings are what we are experiencing all the time. But there's a sense of an I that is experiencing those, right? Thirdly, conceiving our mind to be a real self. I am what thinks and perceives, right? I mean, we do tend to more strongly identify in some ways with the mind as being the self than the body, though we obviously have a strong connection to the body. But in this context, we saw that the body was that location, that place that we reside in. And the I, the mind, seems to reside in that place. Fourthly, we conceive phenomena, in particular the other mental factors, as what make the self afflictive or worthwhile. I have so many problems with anger or jealousy, we might think to ourselves, or I am worthwhile because I am mindful, make effort, and have concentration and wisdom. I mean, there's nothing wrong with identifying those things that are not in accord with how we should be practicing, those things that do afflict us, and those things that are more worthwhile for us, that are more beneficial. The problem is as follows. The way the self is conceived in each of these instances is erroneous. There's a notion of a solid personal identity. We see ourself as standing alone, independent from everything else, and view all other things, including our body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, as arranged around that self. In addition, our present way of conceiving and relating to our body, feelings, mind, and phenomena increases our misconceptions of self. Because again, all of the attachment and clinging that we have to these various things and the emotions that arise on the basis of our feelings and so on, all of these give rise to further distortions. And when we identify, as was said in that last one, when we identify with our anger or jealousy, then this is also a misconception because we tend to think of ourselves in those terms. Or if we think that we're really a wonderful, compassionate, loving, kind person, well, maybe that's a distortion too, and we're not really seeing our faults at that time. So we have these misconceptions that can creep in when we have this sense of a self that is kind of imbued with those four phenomena, the mental factors, the mind, the feelings, and the body, and the distortions that happen with regard to each of them. Another reason that is set out as to why these four were selected by the Buddha as objects of mindfulness is to help us understand how destructive and constructive karma or actions come about so that we can abandon the former and practice the latter. So this is still a very conventional teaching in this context, to look at how karma comes about, but to see that first of all, the body is the chief object involved in our actions. I mean, here we're talking maybe mostly our physical or verbal actions. Obviously, there is mental action. That's where karma is at its deepest level, is the movement of the mind. But our body is what gets us into a lot of creation of karma, positive or negative. Feelings are the aim for which we do these actions. We seek to experience pleasant feelings and to avoid unpleasant ones. Right? Feelings are a problem because we get so attached to wanting them to ensue that we get often to where we create actions on the basis of those that are not healthy. The mind itself is the agent that causes these actions. Our actions don't just happen. The mental factor of intention causes us to act, and it moves that main mind to various things, sometimes in a healthy way, sometimes in an unhealthy way. And then among phenomena, various mental factors such as attachment and animosity constitute the motivating force for our actions. They flavor that intention and that movement of the mind so that we then have various results, because mental factors such as various emotions, they say here, attitudes and views motivate our actions. We must be attentive to what we allow to occupy our awareness. So in this presentation, we have kind of a recognition that when we are relating to these four, that we actually can see how they're really quite directly involved in how we create karma, through the force of our various mental factors, those phenomena that we have, such as attachment, that manifests in the mind, and our intention moves the mind towards a particular object of attraction because we want those particular feelings. We want the pleasurable feeling of having something that someone else owns or whatever the case might be. And then we engage in the action with our body, such as stealing that object or whatever it is that we're doing. So this is also to point out kind of something that is a truth that the Buddha taught, that karma is the vehicle through which we create our experiences, and we are driven to go after particular experiences and to try to create the causes for those. But of course, we fail miserably because we don't understand the law of karma. And the law of karma is an essential thing to know to be able to actually create the causes for real happiness and to avoid the causes for suffering. So this is another way that we can see these four playing a role. So we had the four involved in the sense of self and kind of how it gives rise to a distortion of self. And then we have how the four also are pointed out by the Buddha as very instrumental in giving rise to karma. Okay, so that gives us a bit of more flavor about why we're working with these four. Let's go on to talk about the actual modes of cultivating the four close placements. So, to cultivate insight by analyzing the nature of the body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, we examine both the characteristics they share, and those specific to each. Again, a repetition from earlier. What we often call the general characteristics, and then the specific characteristics. The shared or general characteristics that all four objects have in common is that they are all one, impermanent. Right? Everything on that list. Again, when we specifically look at the mental factors for phenomena, I pointed out that we had permanent phenomena included in there in a more general way. But when we talk about our mental factors as the phenomena, we talk about our mind, the six primary consciousnesses. Then we talk about the three feeling tones that we have, and we talk about our body. All of these are impermanent phenomena. They change moment by moment. Number two, they are all dukkha. They are all unsatisfactory in nature. This is again the first noble truth that the Buddha taught, which we've touched on a number of times, the truth of dukkha, that these things, because they are conditioned by our karma and delusions, they are unsatisfactory. They do not lead to any true happiness. They are what is often translated as suffering. They are also empty, number three, and selfless, number four. Now, when we talk about a coarser investigation into those two ideas, then we aren't referring to the way that we refer to emptiness in the final view of the Buddha, what's often called the Prasangika Madhyamaka view of the Buddha. Again, I've introduced that view again and again throughout these modules, and we'll get into that more in the next two modules in particular. But we can talk about coarser ways that we can have a sense of emptiness, such as the fact that the self, the person, is empty of being some sort of unitary, permanent self, which is what the Vedic traditions believe in, a sense of Atman, the sense of that there's something that is the self that is unchanging. Even the idea of soul in Christianity, when I was growing up Catholic, it kind of seemed like that was what they were referring to, something completely apart from the body and mind that is the essence of who you are. Your little, mirror of God or whatever that you are to be, kind of, that's what goes on to your existence after this in eternity, what have you. So again, that we're empty of that. We are also selfless in the sense of there being some sort of controller of this collection of stuff, like a boss. Can you find the boss among all of this stuff? Just like there's a head salesperson and a bunch of salespeople, is there really somebody who is there among the aggregates, among the body and mind, who's playing that role? That's how empty and selfless are generally talked about in the coarser views. But obviously, again, for the bodhisattva, especially in following the tradition that we're following, they want to be sure to realize the deepest form of emptiness. But when we talk about these general characteristics, then we can say that all four of these are impermanent. They are in the nature of dukkha, unsatisfactory. They are empty of having that kind of permanent sense of self. They are also selfless in that they don't have this idea of a controller being there in charge of all of this. So you can also, of course, include the view of emptiness that we allude to, that is the emptiness of true existence, but we're going to see that coming up later as the deeper way that the bodhisattvas meditate on these four close placements of mindfulness. So these four characteristics, as it says there now, relate to the first three of the four seals. You may have heard of the four Buddhist seals that distinguish the Buddha's teachings. These verify or seal, confirm that a teaching is in the Buddhist canon. They are four philosophical views that determine whether you are philosophically Buddhist. You might be Buddhist by taking refuge and practicing Buddhism, but if you are philosophically Buddhist, you have to subscribe to these four ideas. We're going to go into these four in the next module, but I wanted to briefly introduce them. Some of you have seen them before. His Holiness and Venerable Children introduced them in this context. The first one is that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. Everything that arises from causes changes moment by moment without ever remaining static. Secondly, all polluted phenomena, polluted means contaminated together with ignorance created through the force of delusion. All of these polluted phenomena are unsatisfactory or suffering in nature. That is, they are under the influence of disturbing attitudes and polluted actions. So those are the two that were just talked about previously, impermanent and dukkha or unsatisfactory. These refer to, again, everything that is in the basis for a person, because all of what we talked about, body, feelings, mind, and then the mental factors that are among phenomena, they are all impermanent. They are all conditioned, arising through the force of their causes and conditions. And then also they are all in the nature of suffering, because the way that they are arising in our current continuum are all together with ignorance, all through the force of our own disturbing attitudes. Then number 3 in the 4 seals includes the 2 that we looked at, empty and selfless. All phenomena are empty and selfless. And then by understanding these 3 seals, we come to realize the 4th seal of Buddhism, which is that nirvana is peace, that there is a state where one can pacify all of one's own afflictions and karma and what have you, and know that peace, know that sort of natural state that the mind can be in when all of that is removed. So the reason why this 3rd seal includes both selfless and empty and isn't described in the way we would normally describe it, that it's the empty of having a permanent self, empty of having, or selfless of having a controlling kind of self-sufficient self that's in charge, is because it has to apply to all Buddhist tenets. I touched briefly on the tenets. Remember the tenet systems? There are 4 different tenet systems. I won't go into great detail on them, but we'll talk about them in the next module more. But essentially, the Buddha taught a variety of things to a variety of disciples. And he didn't teach the most profound view of emptiness to everyone, because not everyone was ready for that. So for those who weren't quite ready, he taught these other views that are completely accurate. It is true, we are empty of having a permanent unitary self here. There is no soul, no Atman. The Buddha refuted that. He also refuted that there's a controller, that there's someone in charge of these mind-body complex. Those can be known, and they're worthwhile investigating and knowing, especially if we've had some exposure to various philosophical or religious tenets that teach that there is a soul, an Atman. But those aren't the final view of the Buddha. But anyway, the idea here is that those 4 general characteristics are all included in the first 3 of the 4 seals. They are speaking to the general way that the Buddha taught about how things exist, that everything that is conditioned is impermanent, that everything that is contaminated with our ignorance is in the nature of suffering, dukkha, and that all phenomena are empty and selfless. And finally, that nirvana is peace, that there is a state where you can be free of all those misconceptions. Again, I'm just pointing them out because they're in the context of describing these various general characteristics. We'll go into them in a bit more detail in the next module. Let's go on to their specific characteristics. I'll introduce them, and then I'm going to go to the chart that I put together for this. But in terms of their specific characteristics, not their shared ones that apply to all 4 equally, each of the 4 objects of mindfulness is related to one of 4 distorted or mistaken conceptions. This is what I was starting to talk about earlier. I apologize. I've been doing that. Sometimes I get my wires crossed and start jumping ahead or talking about something that I shouldn't be. So sorry, but these are the 4 conceptions that Rinpoche often teaches on, and they're in that book again, Bodhisattva Attitude. First, with regard to the body, we regard the body as attractive, but it actually is unattractive, or we think of it as pure when it actually is impure. Secondly, we regard what is suffering in nature as pleasant or happy. So with regard to the 3 feeling tones that we have, those feelings that are pleasurable, we think are really true pleasure, but they are actually dukkha in nature. They are actually suffering. Third, we regard the impermanent as permanent. And this is with regard to the mind. Because we so strongly identify the self with the mind, we think there's some sort of permanent, unchanging self that is abiding together with all of that. And we don't see the impermanent nature of the mind, that the mind is actually changing every single moment. Then finally, with regard to the mental factors and other phenomena, we regard the selfless as having a self. And here we can certainly, use the deeper definition of selflessness or emptiness. But the idea is that those things, because all phenomena lack a self when it comes to that deeper view, we mistakenly apprehend things as having a self. So let's look at the chart that I put together for this. Maybe this will be another aid that will help you in investigating these. What I've done for this chart, and this is based on a very similar chart that was in His Holiness and Venerable Children's book, is I put the object of mindfulness, the misconception that we just talked about. We'll go through those one more time. And then the specific characteristic that we have to realize that we are trying to discern through insight by investigating them in regard to their specific characteristics. And then shortly, I'll go through the Arya truth that is connected with them in terms of how the four truths are investigated by virtue of those. Okay, so the first one, body. What I said there again is that we hold the body that is actually impure or unattractive as being pure or attractive. And I always point out, I think Jeffrey Hopkins in one of his teachings, he mentioned this. He said, when you come out of the shower or the bath, whatever it is that you do to bathe your body, you feel like you're clean, right? You know, you feel like, okay, you feel pretty pure, like the body is some sort of pristine object then. But we know it isn't, because within, especially if it's like a really warm, humid day, within minutes sometimes, the body's already got some level of impurity again. It's sweating and, you know, various substances coming out of it, what have you. But we have this view of the body, and especially also the way we view other bodies, those that we are attracted to, as having some sort of fundamental purity. But the body is impure. When we look at the actual meditation of doing this shortly, you'll see how we can look at it at various levels in terms of its nature, in terms of the causes of it, in terms of the results of it. And we can see that the body's impure all the way through. We like to hold to some view of it being pure, but it actually isn't. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, we want to undermine a lot of the attachment we have to the body, you know, because obviously we see it in a very different way compared to how it actually exists. So the understanding that we want to get to, let's put that chart back on there, is that the body is impure in nature. Going down to the next one, again, I'll touch on the Arya truth shortly. Feelings. The close placement of mindfulness on feelings helps us to overcome the misconception holding what is suffering or unsatisfactory, dukkha, in nature as pleasurable. Because once more, when we experience pleasurable feelings, when we enjoy some delicious food, or when we have other experiences that are really enjoyable for us, we think that those are true happiness, and we keep chasing after them as if they were true happiness. Keep investing all of our time and energy and money even into getting things that will supposedly bring us happiness. But we don't see that those too are unsatisfactory in nature, and that they lead us further and further down that rabbit's hole of suffering. So feelings are unsatisfactory in nature is the understanding that we want to glean from that investigation. Number 3, mind. This involves us holding that which is momentarily changing as unchanging, or what is impermanent as being permanent. Remember, permanent here, doesn't refer to eternal. Our minds are eternal. Our minds are always arising from a previous moment of mind, as we saw in the first module. So we never have a moment of mind that is arising on its own from nowhere, and the mind never ceases. You don't get to some sort of brick wall that you hit and then mind ceases to exist. Mind will continue to give rise to another moment of mind. So this is something that, again, because we have such a strong identification of the self with the mind, that we think that there's some sort of unchanging essence. I mean, isn't it true that every one of us to some degree feels like there's some continuity of the self, even though we know that we were very different when we were like 10 years old versus when we were 21 years old versus when we were 30 some years old, and so on, and whatever ages. Maybe I'm going beyond some of the ages of some of you, but there isn't that unchanging self, right? There isn't some sort of constant that is there. But we tend to think that is, and it exists, and it's more or less kind of the mind. We tend to once more identify quite strongly with the mind. So this is the misconception that meditating on close placement of mindfulness of the mind helps you to overcome, to realize the understanding there that the mind arises and passes away each moment. So when the mind is your object, you're paying attention to that momentary arising of things. The last one, the phenomena, which again mostly is focused on the mental factors that are not feeling, the other 50 mental factors. Holding what lacks a self as having a self? Well, again, this one's a little tricky because I would say this isn't necessarily just a specific characteristics of this one, because it could actually be, again, a general characteristic of all of these. But nonetheless, this is where we're going to focus on it, is all of those sorts of other aspects of our mind that we think are sort of inherent and real, and they don't have that at all. As it says there in the third column, phenomena are not the self. These mental factors are not the self, and some phenomena are to be practiced and others abandoned. I mean, there's good purpose to knowing the mental factors and to being aware of them. That's why we spent some time on them in the first module, because some are to be adopted and some are to be discarded because they only lead to suffering. But nonetheless, we have to get rid of the misconception that thinks that there's some sort of inherent self within those mental factors or within other phenomena that exist. So again, that's the gist of looking at them in terms of their specific characteristics. So now we have to go on to do a little bit deeper investigation as to how we do this. Mindfulness of the body involves reflecting on, as I just said a short while ago, the causes of the body, the nature of the body, the result of the body. So what are the causes of the body? The causes of the body are the two reproductive cells that your parents, from your parents that united in your mother's womb, that became the essence of this body, right? I mean, those cells are long gone. But nonetheless, if those two hadn't come together, the continuity of physical matter, that is the body you have currently, would not be here. Well, are those two cells pure in nature? I have to share this. It's kind of weird, but in the book, I don't know if it was Venerable Chodron who edited all of these teachings from His Holiness or whether it was His Holiness himself, but they said, if these reproductive fluids of your parents were on a table, you'd be grossed out or you'd be totally averse to them, right? They're nothing to be enamored of. The causes of this body are these two cells that came together and started the whole process. What's the nature of the body? Well, Master Shantideva in his 8th chapter of Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life has a very intricate investigation into the nature of the body, where he starts picking it all apart and looking at, well, what really is the body? And I often point out to people that if you were to take just a sliver of skin off of the body, you would be repulsed by the body, right? We get attracted to this superficial sense of skin that is encompassing and enveloping all of the gross parts of the body. All we do is cut through the skin and we can see it all there, all the blood coming out and the vessels and the tendons and whatever. I mean, all the various things that exist inside the body. And of course, we have all of the undesirable substances within the body that we once more try to avoid. Is it so attractive really in terms of its actual nature? We cover the body with a superimposition of it being quite attractive and beautiful and pure, but it isn't that at all. And we don't have to go very far to prove that to ourselves. What's the result of the body? Well, where does the body end up? This body that, we pamper and take care of and feed and exercise and do all these things, it ends up being worm food if, it goes into the ground and has that opportunity, or combusts when you cremate the body or whatever. There's nothing kind of pure that remains. There's no real purity. In fact, once more, if we had a corpse in a room, after a while, you'd just want to be so far away from it because it's repulsive. The result of this body is nothing, again, to be that enamored by. Now, when you do this sort of meditation, you might start to develop a sense of aversion to the body. It's meant to not do that, but rather to correct your perception of the body. It's not to make you say, well, then I should just totally neglect this body, just don't even pay any attention to it because it's just a pile of garbage. That's not necessarily the response that you're supposed to get to. You're supposed to once more try to undermine that misconception that believes the body to be pure, that sees it through that attractive lens and only through that attractive lens. Remember that one of the, I don't know if we talked about a little bit, I think, when we were in the first module on attachment. Whenever we have a mind of attachment that is only seeing the attractive aspects, the first remedy we should bring in is to balance it out by seeing the unattractive aspects, but not to go overboard and only focus on the unattractive aspects so that we, again, totally neglect this body. But we see it for what it is. It's just a vessel that we are using while we are here, embodied, to be able to do our spiritual work. It's not so important that we go overboard with regard to paying undue attention to the body and so on. Okay, we better get going. We're coming up on time here. I didn't realize I'm getting a little more wordy than I should. To establish mindfulness of feelings, first observe your mental and physical sensations. Second, identify the pleasant, the unpleasant, and neutral feelings without all the extra conceptualizing about the feeling or its source. This is the problem, is that we remember how we get in trouble as these feelings arise. We over embellish the pleasant ones with pleasantness. We over embellish the unpleasant ones with unpleasantness. And we even do that with the neutral feelings. And we end up having responses to them that are driven by delusion. And thereby we create karma. In mindfulness of feelings, observe and examine the causes and the results of feelings. What are the cause of your feelings? It's having contact with objects, right? Whether they be physical objects that induce those sensory feelings, or whether they be mental objects that induce a mental feeling. Karma is also a cause of feelings. The pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings we experience are the results of our previous actions. We'll look at this in more detail when we get into the module on the path. But that's why we have particular feelings, is through the force of our past karma. They are also causes of our feelings. The results of feelings are craving and clinging. So if we look at this, we see that this is all caught up in samsara, all caught up in suffering and the origins of suffering, how we are creating the causes to continue to perpetuate our stay through having unhealthy reactions to pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. We end up going after these feelings even more, craving and grasping them and so on. Awareness of this evolutionary process of feelings leading to afflictions, which motivates karma that causes rebirth, makes us pause when feelings arise so that they don't act as a catalyst for afflictive emotional responses and for the creation of destructive karma. So this is kind of one of the other purposes behind this, is that if you begin to see that that's how we're getting caught up in it, then you simply see them as feelings that are arising and you don't have your habitual reactions. Why should I get attached to that pleasant feeling when I see it for what it is? It's caused by all sorts of contaminated karma from the past. It's only going to give rise to future contamination if I continue to follow those minds of attachment and so on. So it can be very powerful, again, to help undermine a lot of our habitual patterns. Mindfulness of the mind helps to overcome the distortion of believing what is impermanent to be permanent. The mind of the past is now gone. The mind of the future is yet to come, right? We can see the impermanent nature of the mind if you really focus on this flow of mental moments, this stream of consciousness. There is only the present mind, it says, but this too is ever changing and does not remain in the next nanosecond. I mean, you can't grasp at a present moment of mind. It's all impermanent. It's all under the influence of this continual flow. By maintaining mindfulness on the mind, we will be able to directly perceive its subtle changing nature and understand that even though the mind is transient, its continuity continues. That even though, it's changing moment by moment, it never goes out of existence. We have that sort of reliance that the mind has that continuity. Finally, the last one regarding mindfulness of phenomena, or in this text, it's called Dharma. Dharma, the word Dharma has a lot of different meanings. Oftentimes we refer to the Buddha's teachings, but Dharma also can simply mean phenomena. Tsongkhapa states that the principal phenomena to be contemplated are the factors to adopt and to abandon on the path. So while we were earlier highlighting the mental factors, he said you can also focus on those mental factors specifically that are in those categories. We even saw an allusion to this earlier. Those that are constructive and wholesome that will lead to happiness, those that are destructive and unwholesome that will lead to suffering. So he says here, Dharma refers to both the pure class of phenomena, beneficial mental states to cultivate, and the impure class, afflictions to abandon. By reflecting on these mental factors, we enter the practice of the fourth truth, the true path. So let's correlate these with the four truths using that chart, because this is, in doing these investigations that I just mentioned, you can see how they lead you to the particular truth. If we begin to investigate the body and see that its causes, its nature, its results are all impure and unsatisfactory, we get the idea of the truth of dukkha. We come to understand the truth of suffering that we are intimately involved in with regard to this body. This body is a product of our past karma and therefore is only a source of suffering. Instead, we think it has some sort of pure nature and an ability to give us, something lasting and pleasurable and wonderful. If we look at our feelings, when we understand that evolutionary process that was mentioned earlier in the slides, that from our feelings, we then react through the force of our habitual tendencies and we create karma that causes to have future suffering experiences, dukkha, unsatisfactory experiences. Well, then we get the truth of the origins of dukkha. What are the causes? Are karma and delusions. Karma and delusions are driven by feelings. Okay. Then we get to the third one, and we come to understand true cessation through the mind. Well, specifically because we see the impermanence of the mind, we see two factors. One is because the mind is impermanent and constantly changing, we can change it for the better, right? We can completely purify the mind. Its impermanent nature makes it possible for us to introduce positive states to overcome the negative states and to thus purify our minds and develop those positive states to a greater degree. Therefore, cessation can happen. We can have a cessation to all of what obscures our minds. But also, we won't cease the mind. The mind itself will remain. The continuity of mind will be there. So there's no complete cessation of everything. When you attain nirvana, you don't disappear. Your mind continues on. Mind has its perpetuity. It's eternal. It's constantly changing, constantly arising from another moment of mind, and so on. So that helps us to engage in true cessations. Then finally, the true paths was, as was pointed out by that passage that was mentioned, Tsongkhapa, is that when we attend to the mental factors and we investigate those which are beneficial and wholesome, that are in the pure class versus those that are in the impure class that only lead to suffering, then we come to understand the reality of the path, and we are more discerning about what we engage in. So we can use these four as a entryway to working with the four truths, which again is a topic we will be investigating in our next module. I don't have time to read through this, but this is the other handout that you were sent. And I told you it had the definition. It mentioned these specific characteristics. You might read through this latter part, starting there where it talks about through close placement on the mindfulness on the body, and one comes to understand true sufferings and so on. This is just a recap of what I just said, essentially. So maybe in better words than I used. So let's go back to the slides and finish things off for this class. Okay. Bodhisattvas seek to realize the emptiness of inherent existence of these four: body, feelings, mind, phenomena, as well as the person designated independence on them, as well as to establish their conventional existence in that they exist by being merely designated by mind, which is in the end how all of these things exist. As I said, bodhisattvas will investigate this emptiness with regard to all things, that they lack inherent existence. And then by way of that, they will also come to understand the very subtle way that things exist by being merely labeled, merely designated by mind. So that was a lot of words. So again, what we've discerned tonight, hopefully what you've heard is you have these four objects that you can investigate, and you can look at their specific characteristics that help to undermine some of the mistaken conceptions that are coarser, but nonetheless that we have to deal with. If we keep clinging to this body as pure, or the bodies of others as pure, we're going to keep having the mistaken attitudes of attachment and so on, and we're going to keep creating more karma and have more problems and suffering and what have you. We have to undermine these coarser conceptions as well. But we also want to get at the more general characteristics, and especially, as was mentioned in that last slide, the lack of inherent existence of these phenomena. We didn't go into any techniques to really deeply investigate that yet. We'll get into that when we get to the fourth module. But many of you have been around teachings on emptiness and know how to investigate to see, if you can find some sort of true essence to any of these things. But if we look at the body, for example, where's the real body? We come to understand by picking apart all the various parts of the body that there's no real body here. There's only a label, an idea body, a designation through our conceptual mind that this is a body. And we all sort of agree to that conventionally. And we all say, oh, body. But where's the real body? And we go beyond just a conventional thing like, oh, my body's here. Well, but where's the real body? Where's that thing that is able to stand up as the basis for body in a way that is exactly what we mean by body. Well, there's nothing that is exactly what we mean by body. There's a bunch of parts together that all come together in a various collection and shape that make us us call it a body, but there's no real body. So again, that's a deeper investigation that we didn't have time in this module to go into, but we'll look at that in the future when we actually examine how to discern that correct view of emptiness. So, all right. So any questions? Too many words. I've kind of silenced everybody through all of the words I said, but let me talk really briefly then. Again, I sort of highlighted the topics we looked at earlier when I introduced tonight's topic. So hopefully I don't have to go back over all of that. But I really do hope that, again, this hasn't been discouraging for people, but rather encouraging to be able to at least look at the potential that we have to develop our minds and to use our minds as a very powerful tool. Through meditation, through developing concentration, as well as in this last session in particular, to be able to use analytical ability to discern the nature of things conventionally and ultimately that will be of great benefit on our spiritual path. We will be using analytical meditation more in the future in the modules to come, because there we get into the actual topics of the Buddha's teachings and the Lam Rim that aren't sort of the setup. The setup was knowing what the mind is, knowing what meditation is. Now we're going to go into the next module, a really delightful module, I think. I think it's really quite unique because it uses the way His Holiness often presents Buddhism to Western audiences that's very much grounded in logic and reasoning. It's about truths. It's about the Buddha pointing out particular truths and then us investigating them to come to understand them and see them as truths for ourselves, which is essentially what the Buddhist path is. It's a path of wisdom. And obviously there are many other components involved, but we have to develop that wisdom ourselves through being introduced to these truths and then coming to discern them, coming to know them. So I hope you're able to join that. I realize there's quite a bit of a break between this module and the next module. We had to push it out to January 11th, the start of the next module. Again, the same centers are involved, so you can register with the center you've been involved with. And in the meantime, certainly, yeah, if you have any questions, things come up between now and starting the next module based on your own study of these things that we've looked at, do let me know or let your coordinator know, and I'll try to address questions and what have you. So let's do some dedication prayers. As we pointed out earlier in this module, dedication at the end of our meditation practice, as well as anytime we do any spiritual activity, is so important to make sure that we seal and protect all of this positive potential we've created, so it brings forth the greatest result, the result of the enlightenment of all beings through our own attaining that state. Then the second part of this, the last 4 lines, are all about recalling bodhicitta. And we'll go into this topic in more detail in exploring the path as well. But bodhicitta is an amazing transformative mind that allows us to accomplish our greatest purpose as well as to help others to do the same. So we make that strong prayer that that mind grows and develops within our own hearts and within the hearts of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we do the prayers for our precious teachers. As I usually say, make this by extension a prayer for all of our spiritual guides in Buddhist traditions as well as non-Buddhist traditions, if they are beings who are helping others to practice a path of well-being, compassion, kindness, morality. May these guides continue to be in this world to help us and others so that we can never be parted from a path that leads to ultimate happiness. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. For Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And then, as we always do as well, we'll dedicate for those beings who we're holding in our hearts, whose situation moves us, dealing with whatever suffering they have, suffering of obstacles, illness, who have died, or perhaps those that we know are who are dying at this time. And we send all this positive energy out to these beings. We can especially think about places where there have been natural disasters, or people who are dealing with COVID, various other things that are afflicting people around the world. But especially, again, those that you know and whose situation moves you. Think that they receive this positive energy. It immediately removes their suffering and causes them to have everything that will bring forth perfect happiness and peace for them. And may all beings have that perfect peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Wonderful. Thank you for hanging in there on this module. I know there's a lot of technical stuff and things that, I tried to disseminate as best as I could, but we're going to give this next module, by the way, the next two actually, a little more space, because I've taught them each before as well. And I'm finding that with the level of topics and things we're going through, that it's nice to have a little more room. So I'm hoping they'll get a little more spacious from here on out. Part of why we couldn't make these longer is because we would have had one session in January after all of this, and it just would have been so disconnected. I don't think it really would have been so healthy, but hopefully in the future, these modules will also be a little more spacious for you. So I'll do my best to keep them that way. I won't fill in more information. So, okay, thank you all very much. And again, a very peaceful, happy holiday season. And my gratitude, especially to those who, the centers who are coordinating all of this, and especially those who've played some key roles in helping out. And you know who you are. I don't need to identify you specifically, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to teach this. And I hope that you've benefited from it. Okay, be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.